In this video, we'll go over some of the most common editing mistakes when post-processing your photos. I'm going to show you how to fix these mistakes to help you get better results and make sure that you don't ruin your photos. Let's get into it. The first few mistakes we'll take a look at are actually all being made up here in the basic tone adjustment sliders. And it doesn't matter if you're using Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, Capture One, Luminar Neo, or any other software, you'll likely find these basic sliders in all of them. This is usually where you'll start your editing process, and it's really easy to get carried away moving around these sliders. So for this image here, I'm going to increase the exposure a bit to improve the overall brightness. Now you can see here that's made the highlights a bit too bright, so I will bring those down. And that's usually where the mistake happens, because most cameras nowadays have such a high dynamic range, and these raw files, they carry so much data, we have the possibility to recover a lot of information when post-processing. And this is of course a good thing. But what I often see happen is that people want to recover too much and therefore crank that slider all the way to -100 because, well, then we can see all the highlights, right? But if you do that, you can see that this makes the image look a bit unnatural, and in some cases it can even bring out some weird artifacts. Here it also makes the background look very dull. Naturally, when we would see a scene like this with our own eyes, these highlights would actually be quite bright. Now, just to be clear, I will definitely partly recover this area, but I won't go too far so it maintains that natural look. And you can always check here in the histogram if these highlights are not clipping. Now, an even worse mistake I see, and one that I used to make a lot as well when I was first starting out, is going even further and adding a linear gradient and darkening the sky even more. And the same goes if you're adding, for example, a graduated ND filter when photographing. I think it's good practice to respect what the light is doing in the photo and not try to over manipulate things. And the same thing happens, if not more often, with the shadow slider, because we've all been told and trained to expose for the highlights, which basically means underexposing the image a little bit and then recovering the shadows in post. And again, this is a good technique. There's nothing wrong with it, and I use it very often as well. However, the mistake that a lot of people make is cranking that slider all the way up just because you can. And as you can see, when I do that, it reveals all the information that was in those shadows. And it's pretty amazing what we're able to do. And I'm sure a lot of you have had these like wow moments when suddenly seeing all of these details. But once more, this makes things look very unnatural, and it destroys the natural depth and contrast we had in this image. So just because you can recover all this information doesn't mean that you should. Shadows and darkness in your image is not a bad thing, and it actually helps create depth and dimension in your photo. Just have a look around wherever you are now. Everything looks 3D and has depth because of lights and shadow. If everything would be equally bright, things would look very flat. This concept becomes very clear with this example of a sphere. Without any shadows or dark sides, the sphere looks very flat, and it might as well just be a flat circle. However, once we add shadows, that same sphere actually becomes spherical and three-dimensional. So for this image, I will just increase the shadows a little bit like so. And I also want to add a bit more pop to these flowers, and I'll show you a great way of doing that a bit later in the video. Now, to sum up this first mistake and how to fix it, when adjusting your highlights and your shadows, you're much better off making slight adjustments. Keep in mind how your eyes see the world and respect the light. That way you're maintaining natural looking contrast in your images. And speaking of contrast, this is another slider that is often used excessively. When you add contrast to an image, you're essentially making the shadows darker and the highlights brighter. You can tell as I move the contrast slider towards the right, these darker areas of the image are getting even darker, and the brighter areas up here even brighter. And you can also see that in the histogram. As I move the slider towards the right, the histogram is spreading out, being pushed more towards either side. And while some images will definitely benefit from adding contrast to them, it's important to be subtle with it. Because again, we're trying to maintain the natural look of our scene and only slightly enhancing it. For this image, you can tell by looking at the histogram that we already have a pretty high contrast shot, and we don't need to add much more global contrast. What is actually an even better technique of adding contrast is adding contrast locally and not adding contrast globally, so to the entire image. And this is something we'll get to in a bit, but let me first show you another mistake that I used to make a lot when I was new to photo editing. I would make this mistake especially when editing sunset photos like this one here, but even more so when the conditions were not as great as I had wanted them to be, or just if I wanted to enhance those sunset colors in my photo. And I'm certain a lot of you guys have had images like this as well, so maybe you're also making this mistake technique when editing your sunset photos. What I used to do is start increasing the temperature slider up, and I would see, well, wow, now the sky is starting to look a bit more like a sunset sky. But can you see what has happened now? The problem with raising the temperature slider is that now these warm tones are not only being applied to the sky, but also to the rest of the image. And as you can tell, that doesn't look quite right. The effect might look good in the sky, but it's also being applied on the rocks here and on the whitewash, which just looks a bit off. So a better technique to add some more color to a sunset photo like this would be by using the color grading tool. And if you're unfamiliar with the color grading tool, I actually made a complete guide for just this tool. You can find the video here on the channel if you're interested in diving deeper into this powerful tool. What we can do in the color grading tool is add color to specific areas of our image. And naturally, in a sunset scene, as we can see in this image here, the highlights have a warmer tone and the shadows have a slightly cooler tone. I'm going to use the color grading tool to emphasize those tones a bit. In the highlights color grading, I'm going to select a warmer tone, so something in the orange or yellow range. And then I'll start adding a bit of saturation until I think it looks good. Again, you want to be subtle with this. If you're unsure, maybe just dial the saturation slider back a little bit. And when I turn this adjustment off and on, you can tell it has very naturally warmed up those highlights and accentuated that sunset feel to the photo. Next, I'm going to go to the shadows color grading and select a cooler tone, so something in the blue range, and then start adding a bit of saturation. Again, not too much because we want to be subtle. And let's turn it on and off. You can see this has increased the color contrast in the image and improved the sunset colors, but without ruining the natural colors of the image. When color grading an image, it can help to walk away from the computer and come back to it later, look at it with fresh eyes, and ask yourself if maybe you might have overdone it with the color grade. It also helps to turn on or off the adjustments by clicking the eye icon here and then seeing if you might have gone overboard. Now, while we're on the topic of colors, let's briefly talk about a crucial step in the process of editing photos, a step that is very often overlooked and underappreciated, and that is making sure that your monitor is representing the correct colors, brightness, and contrast. Otherwise, what you're seeing on your screen may not accurately represent the final image when printing or seeing it on another device. So let me introduce you to this Design View series monitor made by BenQ, who are very kindly sponsoring this video. Especially if you're a Mac user like me, this BenQ PD32U monitor makes it incredibly easy to ensure correct color calibration. This monitor features an exclusive MBook or MacBook mode aimed to match the best color consistency between your MacBook and the monitor. But also BenQ's ICC Sync quickly installs pre-calibrated ICC profiles onto your Mac. That makes it super easy to synchronize colors on different devices with a single click. The PD series has Thunderbolt 3 ports to provide an all-in-one connection with your Mac devices. So anything from charging to data transferring to daisy chain technique, you can work on your creative project seamlessly with only one cable. And let's be honest, this monitor just looks cool. It has a sleek, minimalistic, and metallic design that will simply make any desk setup look awesome. So if you're interested in upgrading your editing monitor, I've left a link to the BenQ PD series in the video description. And thanks to BenQ for sponsoring this video. Okay, so we just talked about the importance of adding color locally to our images. But let me show you why you would also want to make other adjustments locally instead of globally. Because this is a mistake that I see a lot of beginners make, and that is only doing adjustments to the entire image instead of picking out certain areas that require certain adjustments. So in this image, for example, I already mentioned how I don't want to brighten up the shadows too much in order to maintain natural looking depth in the shot. But I do want to make these flowers pop a little bit more. So how can we do this? Well, by making local adjustments. And one of my favorite tools to do these local adjustments is the brush masking tool. But also the other masking tools like the linear or the radial tool are great for this type of work. By using masks, you can make adjustments specifically to the areas that need it. So with a new brush mask, I will make sure that I have the feathers set to 100, the flow and density set to 100 as well. And I'm going to increase the exposure a bit, maybe to about 35. And then I'll start painting over these flowers. And I'm not going to paint too much towards the edge of the frame here because I don't want the viewer's eye to go there. And typically the viewer's eye goes to the brighter areas of an image. That is why I'm going to create another brush and this time decrease the exposure and decrease the shadows. And now I'm going to brush over the bottom of the frame here, and that is going to create a kind of border for the eye, pushing it more towards the flowers and further into the image. And I'll also add a few brush strokes here because naturally the grass would be less bright than the yellow flowers. And if I turn this on and off, can you see how that is leading the eye away from the edge of the image towards the flowers and further into the photo? And it definitely makes those flowers pop a little bit as well. Now, one last thing, I also want to continue leading the eye further into the image towards these C stacks, and those are quite dark right now. So I will select a radial gradient, draw it around the C stacks, and then increase the exposure and increase the shadows. And I'm going to turn it a bit towards where the light is coming from to follow the natural flow of the light. And now this takes the viewer from the foreground to the background through the entire image. And to prove my point, let's have a look at the image with only global adjustments next to this one with our local adjustments. Can you see that the one with the global adjustments lacks depth and contrast and looks quite flat? Whereas the one where I just used the masking tools has a lot more dimensionality. The same principle goes for the other image we looked at. Instead of only adding contrast to the entire image, I will also add local contrast. With the brush mask, I can paint in certain areas that I want to darken, like on these darker patches on the rocks. And then with another brush mask, I can then paint in the lighter areas. And this way I'm very precisely choosing where I add contrast, instead of adding it globally to the entire image. Okay, now that we've arrived on the topic of masking, something that has drastically influenced photo editing in the last few years, let's talk about a mistake that I see happen a lot with these new masking features, especially with the sky masking feature or, for example, sky selection in Photoshop. Even though these masking tools make it so easy to create selections for various parts of an image, it can be tempting to trust those tools and quickly continue with your edit. But this can actually lead to some pretty bad looking results. When I make a sky selection here, so opening the masking tools and then selecting sky, at first sight it does a pretty good job, but if I zoom in a bit, especially towards the edges here, can you see what the problem is? Lightroom's out-of-the-box selection sometimes produces quite hard edges, which can lead to artifacts and halos and can potentially ruin your photo. If I decrease the exposure and the highlights of the sky a bit, you can tell that it just doesn't look very good. Especially on this edge here, it's quite noticeable. So I will need to do some fine-tuning. One thing I like to do in Lightroom to avoid these hard edges is by clicking subtract in the sky selection mask and then selecting a linear gradient mask. If I now draw this linear gradient up from the bottom of my sky selection mask, it will result in a nice gradient instead of this very hard looking edge we had before. So the exposure adjustment I made to the sky just kind of fades out as we reach those edges, and that just looks a lot more smooth and natural. So let's have a look at the before and after. And let's compare to the image without adjusting the sky selection. You can see how that transition is not as harsh, and especially on this edge here, you can see that there were a bit of halos without adjusting the sky mask. Now, all of this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be creative in your photo editing and that you have to avoid everything that isn't according to the rules, because it's definitely important to find your own style in editing, but there are some guidelines to follow or keep in the back of your head while doing that. And one of those things which I believe is incredibly valuable in photo editing and something we touched on in this video are local adjustments. An incredibly powerful way to do local adjustments to your images is by using luminosity masks. What the heck are luminosity masks? Well, in this video, I'll show you a free Photoshop plugin that will allow anyone from beginner to pro to do some pretty impressive and refined photo editing. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!